So I think everyone who's watched my content up until now can just tell how much of a huge Persona fan I am. I've mentioned various times throughout my channel that I am a huge fan of Persona 4 and Persona 5. And if I'm being honest, these two games were just my ultimate coping factor for the quarantine phase back in 2020. And they're also quite literally on my avatar and in the banner of my channel. And I would say that during this time of quarantine, it was really an era, it was really a time where a lot of people were confused on what was going to be the future, if we were just going to stay here like this for years to come, for the future in general. And our fate was really just undecided, and I was just really, again, in a confused state, just asking myself, what am I going to do? I mean, I don't want to spend all of this time depressed and moody and just isolated in my room, so I guess make the best out of it. And when I encountered Persona 4, because it was ported over, Persona 4 Golden was ported over in Steam, and it came out in the summer during that time. I just felt that my entire life changed, and I mean that not in an exaggerated way, because believe it or not, I spent over an entire month just playing Persona 4 Golden. Literally my life's goal to just complete that game. No matter what, no matter, again, they getting the best ending I could, or just getting almost everything I could get. And then the same enthrallment became for Persona 5, which the extra content and yada yada yada. And I also got a platinum in the game with all the themes and avatars for PS4. So yeah, that's even a bigger flex, and that took me months as well to just grind over, which I don't want to flex, but that's a huge achievement. And as my obsession with the Persona franchise just kept on evolving, I just said, you know what, I want to just go back to the older games. Why not just play the older games, despite them, I guess, being surely outdated? I've been just hearing a lot of great things, and I've been hearing a lot of great things about Persona 3. Yeah, I don't mind if I had to play it through an emulator. Shit, I was even thinking about getting a whole PS2 just to play that game. That's how involved and obsessed I was with the Persona franchise. And I remember having some great memories playing the PS2, because when I was a little kid, I was playing Call of Duty 2, I was playing with Star Wars, I was playing a lot of games in the PS2, man. That thing's like the OG, and I just feel like an old head right now. Sure, it can open a whole box of memories, but I was just mostly laser focused and just trying to play Persona 3. I sort of had this thing of just trying to absorb the atmosphere depending on the time zone, and just seeing how the Persona games have progressed steadily throughout the years, and seeing the gaps it has between. I mean, Persona 3 was made, I think, 2 years prior to Persona 4 being made, which is like an extremely crazy time frame, because given how these games are 80 hours or more, and how long it takes to just record the lines for the voice actors and just write the story, the gameplay, yada yada yada. Again, it's an insane time frame, but it does make sense, because after Persona 4 there was a huge departure, and then they re-released Persona 4 Golden, and obviously the DS games, and then then they actually released Persona 5. If I'm being honest, Persona 3 perfectly encapsulates what that whole era was all about. For the soundtrack fusing some J-pop with some hip-hop here and there, from the characters looking something from early 2000s or mid 2000s emo kid as hairstyle, or just attitudes in general, and also the way a lot of these characters talk, and obviously the outdated sound effects, because it was a PS2 game, to be fair. I'm always just surprised of how they managed to just capture these moments, and there's like these time capsules that every time you play a different Persona game, it's like you're transported to this place. It's like if it's 2008, 2005, 2006, it's like you're convinced you're in that time frame. It doesn't feel, I guess, exaggerated in a way. It feels just nostalgic, or it feels like you're just in that era. And aside of that, this was the huge departure for the Persona series. Persona 1 and 2 followed a more relatively straightforward style, where it was kind of felt like a more generic JRPG, or just typical JRPG gameplay, which in today's standards feels extremely outdated. But with Persona 3, however, they wanted to reinvent themselves and become much more serious with its gameplay and its character, seeking for a bigger upgrade. And honestly, they did. From the average gameplay span of Persona 2 and 1 being around 30 or 40 hours, they doubled the time and cranked it up to around 80 hours. Now, this was a huge risk for Atlus in general. I mean, think about it. Super long games at the time didn't really have that much of a market. Sure, I mean, yes, there's a logic that, the longer the game lasts, I guess the better, because it's worth your money. It's worth every cent, a dollar, and everything. But The problem with this is that it would require a lot of the player's attention span, and if we're being honest, the average attention span of a lot of gamers is kind of low, especially from a time where a lot of these shooter games were coming out. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas, Miami Vice City, a lot of these Grand Theft Auto games were making the wave, and they were taking up the entire market, as well as Call of Duty and Halo games that were just, at the time, starstruck everybody who was just into gaming. So Persona 3 coming in here as an outsider, requiring a lot of the patience of the gamers, was a very hard thing to accomplish. And while it did do relatively well, and while it didn't necessarily did horrible in the sales mark, it showed that this was a huge risk, and especially a huge budget. And I guess despite all of those things that came in with this game, I'm kind of glad they took the risk they took, because without that risk, this formula would never happen. We would never have Persona 4 nor Persona 5, which is marked as their best-selling game and one of the best-selling titles in the PlayStation 4 history. But unfortunately, it's not perfect. It's, in fact, very far from being perfection. Persona 3 plot-wise is honestly just like any other Persona. You have your group of teenagers who are just living their ordinary lives until they're exposed to a specific power called Persona. And this Persona basically lets them enter this world called Tartarus. And every full moon, Tartarus has a specific boss that appears. There are over 13 or 14 full moons throughout the game, meaning there are a total of 14 main bosses that you have to go through. To sort of counter-argue my original point, saying that this is almost like any other Persona game with a group of teenagers, well, I guess what I was trying to refer to is that obviously you have your cast of teenagers trying to go through life, trying to go through emotions and stuff. But in the first 2 hours of the game, it's almost like if already a fraction or a half of the team is already formed. The reason why I say this is because there's an ongoing investigation titled SEES, which is supposed to be a Specialized Extracurricular Execution Squad, where a specific group of students try to eradicate Tartarus, or at least try to do their best to wipe off shadows to protect the people in the real world, because these shadows can actually hurt people and can turn them kind of brain dead. Persona 3 is seen as the darkest entry in the Persona franchise. Depression, suicide, self-doubt, a lot of other themes that are seen as very dark and edgy. I will say that Persona 3 tries its absolute best to just not seem as a very super edgy, trying to be social critique type game that loses its way. I think from beginning to end, it honestly just continues on a very straightforward path. It doesn't seem like it's stopping. But the issue with this is that it's juggling a lot of themes. And while it is explored kind of well here and there, it could have been explored even more. And it kind of gets me frustrated that they didn't, because when you're bringing these topics to the table, you should definitely explain it in a much more thorough way. My first example is with Shinji's social link. Huge spoilers for people who haven't played the game. Shinji is actually introduced very early on in the game. We just mostly see a teenager who's just going through some things. He's really involved in this dark alleyway type of area. He's mostly in a more abandoned section. He seems lost. He seems kind of depressed. He seems lonely, and he's just really trying to make it out alive despite his circumstances. But he has a very close affiliation with Akihiko. Despite them being in an uneven playing field, they still communicate with each other here and there. For the middle section of the game, however, we get to see more involvement with him. He actually joins our crew. He tries to help us eradicate the Dark Hour, but it's not really for the sake of the universe or for the sake of the world. He doesn't really care about these topics, as he just mostly cares about himself as he's struggling and trying to cope. It's mostly because he wants to prevent any future mistake. You see, there's a character called Ken Amada who also joined the group, and he's only a kid. He's really just in elementary school, and he's trying to avenge his mom, who unfortunately died doing this type of thing. The thing is that Shinji feels that he's to blame for these actions. He feels that he's to blame for not saving his mom on time. And as the story progresses later on, Ken realizes that Shinji was the one to blame, and he sort of tries to seek revenge more on Shinji than he does on the Shadows. This is a great narrative twist. However, it's not explored well. You see, every character, or at least most of the characters in this game, have social links, which was obviously introduced in this game, and it's part of the identity and what makes this game so relevant and popular today is because it introduced this system of you can do side quests, and these side quests will be sort of like mini storylines, explain more in depth these arcs, and explains more these layers of these characters as you're going on with a more personal adventure with them, being involved in adventures with them, getting to know them better. It's like if you're trying to make friends or get a deeper connection with these people, and you get rewarded with this by every social link you do, as you confuse more personas depending on your arcana, and that means you get stronger. The issue is that with Persona 3, however, you don't have a social link with Shinji, which is very weird and awkward, especially since he's supposed to be an essential part of your crew. If you can't really talk with your crew, if you can't really just get to know this specific character who just literally entered your life and is supposed to be important, then why even introduce him or get him involved in your crew in the first place? The problem with this lack of communication as well is that it goes against the own philosophy of Persona. Persona, aside of it being a cool dungeon crawler game, is supposed to get you involved with these characters, spend time with them in your daily lives, be involved in situations, get to know them better. And just not getting to know basically someone you're going to trust your life with is just very narrow, and is kind of a very dumb way to just push them aside, especially since you have 80 hours to give us a more detailed story. And it wouldn't be as harsh as I'm being right now if it didn't take Atlas 3 games to include a social link. You're telling me the original game, Persona 3, you couldn't put a social link? Now, I understand not including a social link in Persona 3, they were trying to do things, maybe they weren't thinking necessarily straight, despite that being an issue. But in a remastered and a re-enhanced port of the game, especially including a whole different 30-hour segment with the answer, which is supposed to be an epilogue of Persona 3. You're telling me that even with that, you couldn't include a sort of mini short social link involving Shinji, in which he is looked upon as, I guess, one of the most beloved characters of Persona, despite him being just cast away in this game. What makes matters worse is that you kill off this character, I would say, pretty early on. The reason why I'm saying pretty early on is because despite him being introduced more into the mid section of the game, despite him being more involved in the mid section of the game, everything else just feels even longer than the mid or beginning section of the game. And you start to wonder, you almost start to forget who was Shinji. If I were to put myself in the shoes of one of the Persona 3 writers, and as I'm seeing every character is supposed to be someone essential, even if he's supposed to die or whatnot, I still wouldn't treat him as a castaway. I wouldn't treat him as just someone you can just simply just remove. You see, you're throwing these themes of drug abuse, depression, suicidal tendencies, these 3 pillars that almost make a part of the identity of this game and give it the darkness and edginess that this game carries in general. And he's supposed to be sort of an allegory to all of these themes. I have to say, some of these social links are very late into the game. Aegis' social link literally starts in January 8th, which, for those who don't know, January 8th is supposed to be the final month of the game, at least gameplay-wise, which again is extremely late. And while this is accomplished, it is accomplishable to just max out her social link. That would literally require you to be almost nearly every day spending time with her. The issue with these things of introducing social links extremely late into the game especially Aegis, who was literally introduced 20 or 30 hours into the freaking game. You had almost all the entire time to just, I guess, develop her social link right off from the get-go. And I understand that it's the whole point of her learning human emotions, going through emotions, understanding the whole human subconscious. I understand that sort of trope in general, but it shouldn't take a character this long, especially in the endgame segment, to just try to develop a social link with you, especially after some traumatizing moments that she went through, as saving the entire crew from a mid-death situation, which literally happened back in November or December of the game. So once again, why not just throw a social link? Why not begin the social link during that time period, which it literally proved that Aegis was starting to become humanized? Why throw it in the end game, where you're supposed to be preparing in Tartarus, trying to max out and crank out as much levels as you can to fight the final boss? It's kind of ironic that Persona 3 has a very broken dungeon system when the entire series really spawned off of being a dungeon crawler game. I think Tartarus is very clunky in its own mechanics. You see, there are 264 floors in Tartarus, and I would say for every 20 or 30 floors you go in the game, you encounter a specific wall that does not let you pass until the next full moon, meaning until the next boss fight. In which I don't think this mechanic is necessarily a bad mechanic. I understand it. I guess it sort of prevents you from going too far into the game and I guess breaking the game in pieces, because at that point you would probably be level 99 and would just be decimating every full moon boss that you probably would be beating really early on in the game. I understand that thing. Trying to, I guess, set a power level dynamic. I understand. But that kind of falls apart too, because you see, the issue is that early on in the game, you get slim to nothing in terms of XP. Like, grinding in the first few floors of the game is honestly pointless, because the XP drops are like 5 or 10 XP, which is honestly like, it's embarrassing to just see in the game. And I understand, obviously they're not going to give you 5,000 XP right out the get-go from a boss fight early on into the game, or from grinding in general, but these are not reasonable drops. And what makes matters worse is just how slow and sluggish it is to get through Tartarus. I understand that by every block that you go, which means you go deeper and deeper and deeper into Tartarus, there's a different layout, there's, I guess, quote-unquote more interesting areas and whatnot, but it's still the same thing. You're still fighting the same shadows, it's just disguised differently. You're still grinding endlessly and sluggishly, slow and over and over and over and over until you get to the next wall that prevents you from going further into the game, which just honestly starts questioning, should you really even continue this game? Like, you're better off, you could probably get more enjoyment not playing the game than playing the game. And I understand people can be like, you know what, just don't go to Tartarus and you can enjoy the game by doing social links and other things. I understand that logic, but then there's the other thing. This is a JRPG we're talking about, and level systems in JRPGs are crucial, and it is literally the most important aspect of a JRPG. If you're not high level enough, you're going to get absolutely destroyed and decimated regardless of how good you are in the game. I don't like drawing comparisons or not, and I understand that 4 and 5 are obviously later entries that will look back on this and reflect on these issues and probably try their best to improve on these issues drastically. But what I love 4, which quite literally came out like 2 or 3 years after Persona 3 coming out, is that it has its own flavor, it has its own design. You see, every sector, every boss that you fight has their own dungeon, and it has their own personality. Every floor is almost unpredictable. With Persona 3 on the other hand, there's no identity. Tartarus just seems like a blandly made, copy-pasted generic dungeon. It feels more arena-esque, you're just throwing shit at the wall until something, I guess, sort of sticks. That is, once again, absolutely terrible level design. The boss of Persona 3, for the most part, lacks so much identity. I can't really name you a single boss in here aside of the final boss, because the names of a lot of these bosses sound more like generic enemy types than an actual memorable name. These main boss fight names are just name of the arcana, For instance, the first boss that you encounter in May 9th is called Priestess, and then the one on June 8th is Emperor and Empress. Once again, it's based on the Arcana. That's the boss fight that you fight. I understand where they're coming from. Lore-wise, it is said that after defeating all the 13 full moon bosses, it actually gave strength and resurrected the final boss, which is Nyx. And through every phase of Nyx, we go through different arcanas. Now that alone is a very great twist and implication, but the problem is, these names are just not memorable. Why not just put them more interesting names and just put them the arcana they're supposed to be located on? And I think what makes it even worse is that a lot of these fights are very slow. There's some that can stretch out for like 20 or 25 minutes, and it just feels like they're a complete damage sponge that almost goes nowhere. And what doesn't make it any better is that even after beating these bosses, there is a horde of dialogue afterwards, and it just takes you probably an extra hour, 30 minutes until you can save your game, which is something that I absolutely despise from this game, and just proves even further that the later installments would clean up the mess and obviously improve along the way. As in Persona 4, it is much noticeable that at every critical point or after defeating an important boss, you can almost save right away. It just takes 5 or 10 minutes worth of cutscenes or dialogue, and boom, you're right there. If not, sometimes you can save quite literally after defeating the boss. You see, this is very important and essential because it would relieve a lot of tension and stress from the players. They don't have to necessarily be on the lookout or feel pressure to just skip through the entire cutscenes or dialogue, which is basically essential to the whole plot and story, just for the sake of saving, so they feel that they're insured and they feel that if something happens to the console or something happens to the game, they still have the progress right there saved, kept away, and they don't have to retry for the boss God knows how many more times, especially given how, again, the gap between beating a boss and saving is just so big. Nyx, I would say, is a very complex and brilliant boss fight, given the context of her being the goddess of death, basically becoming the end of the game, the end of everything, the end of the universe. Basically, the entire weight of the universe is placed on your shoulders and your teammate, everybody in general. What makes this fight stand out from a lot of different boss fights is because it not only is an extremely long fight, but it has a purpose. You see, even for 13 or 14 phases, every phase has a different arcana. I think what makes it so special and important is that it's almost like a different step of life. You see, with the Lover's Arcana, talking about love and talking about admiration, to then the sudden twist to the Death Arcana, meaning the end of everything, the end of time, the thing that's unavoidable that we're all going to experience at some time. It's the unavoidable thing that every human being and every living organism will face at a certain amount of time. And I love that the last arcana, Death, being her true arcana, is a long 6,000 HP health bar. And this might sound like a masochist. The reason why I think it's kind of brilliant is because it kind of just shows how long life could be. It feels like a stretch sometimes, and how menacing it can be to confront death itself in its complete form. I feel that too many people overlook this and just place it as one of the longest boss battles in history, which it honestly is, but they don't really seem to analyze the allegory or symbolisms for what this boss fight is trying to convey. It's basically almost an entire summary of what this game is all about. It almost just answers this question of what is life. I just keeps repeating throughout the story. She's trying to find her own human condition and trying to understand the human behavior of society in general, and tries to become and blend in with the human race. And what I love about this fight, and what I love about the ending and stuff like that, is that it sort of answers it, as it sort of brings unity. You don't necessarily need to be a superhero or hero to be someone important or essential, or to have a purpose. You just really need to be around people. You need to be united with people who make you feel good. You stick by their side. You die. It's sort of like a ride or die situation, that you die with the people who you love. Which is honestly a beautiful message that I think Persona 3 conveys excellently. Aside of my issues and gripes with the social links and sort of story progressions here and there, I have to admit, out of all the casts from the Persona games, this one I think is possibly the most interesting, in the sense that even the smartest and confident characters are honestly kind of the most fragile characters of the entire crew. When Akihiko loses his old friend, he goes into absolute fear. He feels that he just lost almost everything. He lost something who passed on him, and he basically lost someone who he deemed as possibly the strongest person ever, which just brings the question of fear and temor, and it just makes him ask these questions as if he's as strong as he believes he is. When Mitsuru loses her own father, she goes into complete depressive state, being completely unreactive and unresponsive to any of her teammates, which I think is an excellent showcase of grief and denial. Shinji in the outer shell, I mean, people see him as a badass who can beat up anybody without hesitation. Yet in the inside, he's very fragile, as he's relying on drugs to make him relieve pain and for him to forget all of these bad, twisted memories that he has. So I was going to touch on the infamous you can't control your party problem, which obviously a lot of people have talked about and a lot of people have shared their own disgust and disappointment about, but I'm going to give this thing a slide because if I'm being honest, I don't think like 90 or 95% of the time my entire team acted like a bunch of dumbasses playing the game. Like, sure, there were times where I pressed full attack and for some reason Misura was healing or she wasn't using the appropriate spell. That was obviously the target's weakness, but I don't think it affected me to the point that it just made me want to stop playing the game. Yes, it can be sort of bullshitty here and there, but for the most part I think it's sort of controllable once you get the hang of it. Actually, for the first time in a Persona game, your choices do matter. I mean, obviously Persona 4 had that, you know, alternative ending type of decisions, and sometimes, and also in Persona 5, we should get the good or bad ending. I get it, you know, there's also that, and there's that option here in the game. But what I mean is that in the social links when you're talking with people or whatnot, like, your choices do depend on how you're going to progress, or if you're ever going to progress, period. The thing with 4 and 5 is that it's very straightforward, so you really can't make a mistake to the point that it reverses the entire social link or the person gets mad and they'll just not want to spend time with you or be with you. Instead, in 3, which actually just caught me off guard, is that people can get mad at you for doing the wrong thing. There's this one instance where I thought I was dating this one person, and it's like I made the wrong choice because I thought she was giving me hints. And it's like it reversed the entire social link and she called me an asshole, and it was such a cool experience because it actually just got me scared, and I had to just reload my save so I could just not make the wrong decision. It was really funny and very interesting, and if I'm being honest, I kind of wish they had that in the later entries because it just adds so much weight to what you're saying, and it adds more to the immersion experience of like actual realistic depictions of communication. That also gives a bit of charm to Persona 3 and makes it stand out and pretty unique. While Persona 3 definitely has its flaws, there's no denying how essential significant it is to the Persona series. Without it, Persona 4 nor 5 would have its charm and identity that makes it stand out and seen as one of the best JRPGs of all time. Should you play it? Absolutely. Despite my complaints, everyone should at least play this game once. For people wondering where they can play this game since the PS2 game, there's something called an emulator. Just go to PCSX2, don't tell them I sent you there because Sony's gonna grab my ass. But yeah, just go over there, you can download an emulator, you can play this game for free. And guess what? There are actually mods to enhance its performance, but I wouldn't recommend getting you can use the all party mod because I think it'll make the game way too easy. I think you should go for the HD texture mods, which I heard were really good, and just sort of give it like a remaster type of feeling, since Atlas wouldn't really give a fuck to really just remaster FPS, instead give us portable. But anyway, it's a whole different topic. You're asking what I would rate this game? Bro thinks I'm Anthony Fantano for real. Well, with all that taken into account, I'm going with like a light to decent A on this one. Alright, video's over.